The airport was loud in the way airports always are, filled with rolling suitcases, tired voices, and the constant echo of announcements that blended into each other. People stood in long lines, checking phones, adjusting bags, and watching the clock. A delay had already stretched the patience of everyone waiting at the gate. Some sighed loudly, others stared straight ahead, and a few argued quietly with customer service agents who could do nothing more than apologize. When boarding was finally announced, the mood shifted from boredom to urgency. People stood up all at once, forming a loose crowd around the gate, each person convinced they deserved to be first. First class was called, and a small group stepped forward. Among them was a black man in his late 30s or early 40s. He moved calmly, carrying a small leather bag over one shoulder. His clothes were neat but simple. Nothing flashy, nothing meant to draw attention. He had the quiet confidence of someone used to moving through busy places without making noise. He scanned his boarding pass, nodded to the gate agent, and walked down the jet bridge with steady steps. He did not rush. He did not look around to see who was watching. He was focused only on getting to his seat and settling in for the flight. Inside the plane, the air smelled faintly of coffee and recycled air. Flight attendants greeted passengers with practiced smiles. Overhead bins opened and closed as people lifted bags into place. The man found his seat near the front of the plane, next to the window in first class. He placed his bag overhead, sat down, and buckled his seatbelt. That was when the shift happened. The woman sitting across the aisle noticed him. She was already seated, her designer purse resting carefully on her lap. She had been watching the aisle closely, her eyes moving from passenger to passenger as they boarded. When she saw him stop at the seat near hers, her expression changed. At first, she stared. Then she frowned. She leaned slightly into the aisle and looked again at the seat number above him, then back at him. Her lips pressed into a thin line. She cleared her throat loudly. "Excuse me," she said, her voice sharp enough to cut through the noise. The man turned his head toward her, calm and polite. "Yes?" "I think you're in the wrong place," she said, glancing around as if waiting for someone else to agree with her. He looked up at the seat number, then at his boarding pass. "This is my seat." She gave a short laugh, not friendly, not amused. "First class?" she asked, raising her eyebrows. "Are you sure?" He nodded. "Yes." She shook her head slowly. "I think there's been a mistake. Maybe economy is further back." A few nearby passengers paused what they were doing. One man stopped adjusting his headphones. A woman across the aisle froze with her phone halfway to airplane mode. The words were not loud enough to stop boarding, but they were loud enough to be noticed. The man remained seated. His face showed no anger, no surprise, just patience. "The boarding pass says the seat," he said evenly. The woman leaned closer to the aisle and waved her hand, as if brushing away his explanation. "These airlines mess up all the time," she said. "You should check again before there's an issue." A flight attendant walked by, smiling as she helped another passenger lift a bag. The woman glanced at her, then back at the man, as if waiting for someone else to step in and remove him. The man turned his gaze toward the window. Outside, the sky was gray and heavy, promising turbulence later. He took a slow breath and rested his hands on his knees. The woman did not like that. She shifted in her seat and spoke again, louder this time. "I paid a lot for this seat," she said, not directly to him, but to the space around them. "And I don't want to be uncomfortable for the whole flight." A few heads turned. Someone 2 rows backside. The tension in the cabin began to grow, thin but noticeable, like static before a storm. The man turned back toward her. "I'm not bothering anyone," he said. She scoffed. "We'll see about that." Boarding continued, but the energy in that section of the plane felt off. People avoided eye contact. Some pretended to scroll through their phones. Others watched quietly, unsure if they should say something or stay out of it. The woman pressed the call button above her seat. When the flight attendant returned, the woman spoke quickly, before the man could say anything. "There's a problem," she said. "I believe this passenger is in the wrong seat." The flight attendant smiled politely and looked at the man. "May I see your boarding pass, sir?" He handed it over without hesitation. The attendant checked it, then smiled again. "This is your seat, sir. Everything is in order." The woman's face tightened. "That can't be right," she said. "Are you sure?" "Yes, ma'am," the attendant replied calmly. "Well, I'm not comfortable," the woman said. "I think this needs to be reviewed." The attendant kept her tone neutral. "If you need anything else, please let me know," she said, handing the boarding pass back to the man. As she walked away, the woman shook her head in disbelief. "Unbelievable," she muttered. The man sat still, his posture relaxed but alert. He had experienced moments like this before. Not exactly like this, but close enough. He knew the pattern. The questioning, the disbelief, the way his presence alone seemed to demand explanation. He did not look at the woman again. She, however, kept watching him. As more passengers filled the cabin, the space grew tighter, the sounds louder. Overhead bins slammed shut. Children complained. Someone laughed loudly a few rows back. Yet the tension between the two seats remained, unspoken but heavy. The woman leaned toward the aisle and whispered something to the man sitting next to her. He shrugged and avoided looking in her direction. She crossed her arms and stared straight ahead, her jaw clenched. The man closed his eyes briefly, not in anger, not in defeat, just to center himself. He reminded himself that the flight would end, like all things do. He reminded himself that his calm was power, even if no one else could see it. As the final passengers boarded, one person walked past and gave him a small nod. Another offered a quiet smile. Small gestures, almost invisible, but they mattered. The plane door closed. The announcement for safety instructions began. The woman adjusted her seat, still visibly irritated. She glanced at the man one last time, her eyes filled with judgment she had not earned. He stared forward, focused on nothing and everything at once. The flight had not even taken off yet, and already the real journey had begun. The plane started to taxi down the runway, and the hum of the engines filled the cabin. People shifted in their seats, some reading, some scrolling on phones, others staring out the window at the gray sky. The woman across the aisle had settled, herself as best she could, but her eyes kept flicking toward the man sitting by the window. There was something about the calmness in his posture that bothered her, as if he had no idea how out of place she thought he was. She leaned slightly toward the aisle, lowering her voice, but still loud enough for the few passengers nearby to hear. "Do you see this?" She whispered to the man next to her, who just shook his head and returned to his phone. "I can't believe they let him sit here. First class. Can you imagine?" Her voice carried just enough irritation that the people around them exchanged uncomfortable glances. The man sitting by the window adjusted his seatbelt and reached for a small book in his bag. He ignored her, focusing on the pages. There was no reaction, no sign that her words affected him. This only seemed to frustrate her more. "Excuse me," she finally shouted, cutting through the murmur of the cabin. The flight attendant had just begun the safety demonstration. "I think there's a mistake here. He doesn't belong in first class." Some heads turned. A few passengers raised their eyebrows. The man glanced at her calmly, then back at his book. His calm was deliberate. He was not trying to be dismissive. He had learned that engaging in conflict often gave it power it didn't deserve. A flight attendant appeared almost instantly, walking briskly down the aisle. "Is there a problem here, Mom?" she asked, polite but firm. "Yes," the woman said, her voice rising with every word. "He's in my section, first class. This is ridiculous. He shouldn't be here. He doesn't belong here." The man closed his book and looked up. His expression remained neutral, though his eyes carried a quiet dignity. "I have a boarding pass," he said. "This is my seat." "There is no mistake." The flight attendant checked his boarding pass again. "Everything is correct, sir," she said. "This is your assigned seat." The woman's jaw tightened. "Well, I'm not comfortable," she shouted. "I don't want to be near him." A few passengers in the nearby seats shifted uncomfortably. Some stared straight ahead, pretending not to listen. Others exchanged glances, unsure whether to speak or stay silent. One man in the row behind muttered, "Wow," but didn't say anything else. The man took a slow breath and leaned back slightly. He said nothing else. He didn't need to. The silence spoke louder than any words he could use. His calmness contrasted sharply with the woman's growing agitation. She pressed the call button above her seat. When the flight attendant returned, the woman wasted no time. "You have to remove him," she said. "He does not belong in first class." The attendant listened patiently, then turned to the man. "May I see your boarding pass again, sir?" He handed it over, calm and composed. The attendant scanned it carefully. "Everything is fine," she said. "This is your seat. You are in the right place." The woman looked incredulous. Her face turned red, and she opened her mouth, but the words came out as a huff instead of a sentence. She muttered, I can't believe this." Some passengers tried to focus on themselves, pretending not to notice, but the energy in the cabin had changed. People were aware of the tension. A couple of passengers whispered quietly to each other. A few others took out their phones, subtly pointing their cameras in the direction of the confrontation. The woman was not done. She continued to whisper to the man sitting next to her, her words full of judgment and disbelief. "I don't know why they would allow this. This is first class. It's not fair. He shouldn't be here." The man by the window stayed still. He didn't respond. He didn't have to. His composure drew attention. It was like he carried an invisible line of strength around him, and no amount of her anger could cross it. The plane began to accelerate down the runway. The vibration of the engines under the floorboards shook the seats slightly. The woman's frustration grew with every passing second. She leaned toward the aisle again, looking for someone to validate her complaints. But nobody stepped in. The flight attendants moved on with their duties. Passengers returned to their activities, some shaking their heads slightly, some glancing toward her with pity or discomfort. Finally, she raised her voice once more. "You're in my section. How do they allow this?" The man spoke quietly but firmly this time. "I am not taking anyone's seat. I have a boarding pass." "This is my assigned place," she scoffed. "You don't understand. I paid for this seat. This is unfair." The flight attendant came by again. "Ma'am, sir is in the right seat. There's nothing more we can do." Her eyes darted around the cabin. Some passengers looked away, not wanting to get involved. Some whispered to each other about how ridiculous the situation had become. A few people, more quietly, seemed to take mental notes, perhaps thinking about the story they would tell later. The man by the window took a deep breath and closed his eyes for a moment, a subtle gesture to center himself. He reminded himself of all the times he had faced judgment and misunderstanding. It was tiring, yes, but he had learned that maintaining composure was stronger than letting anger take over. The woman, meanwhile, tapped her foot impatiently. Her face grew redder, her hands fidgeted, and she muttered under her breath, "Unbelievable. Absolutely unbelievable." A small group of passengers, 2 rows behind exchanged glances, and one of them whispered to another, "Why does she think she can just treat someone like that?" A man by the window did not hear them. He focused on the feeling of the seat beneath him, the hum of the engines, the slight vibration of the plane moving faster along the runway. He focused on the idea that soon the altitude would rise, the view out the window would change, and this moment, like so many others, would pass. The cabin grew quieter as the plane lifted off the ground. The wheels left the runway, the engines roared, and the woman grabbed her armrest as if bracing herself. She shot a sharp look at the man, clearly hoping he would react, but he continued to sit quietly, his posture relaxed, almost as if nothing had happened. Flight attendants moved through the cabin, offering drinks and assistance. Some passengers watched the woman, curious if she would continue, but she seemed spent for the moment, leaning back in her seat and frowning, even as the plane climbed. Into the clouds, the tension between the two of them lingered. It was not loud anymore, but it was heavy. Nearby passengers were aware of it, the quiet kind of awareness that made people uncomfortable. A man picked up his book again, turning a page, while the woman muttered under her breath. Every so often, she glanced at him, her expression a mix of disbelief and irritation. He ignored her completely. He didn't need to say anything more. The calmness in his demeanor spoke for him. The flight attendants moved past, checking on passengers, smiling politely, and the cabin slowly returned to its normal rhythm. Drinks were poured, luggage was stowed securely, and the hum of the engines became a steady backdrop. But the energy in that part of the plane had shifted permanently. People had seen the woman's anger and the man's quiet dignity. Some felt embarrassment for her behavior. Some admired the man's patience. And some simply watched, knowing that this was one of those moments that would be remembered long after the flight. The man's eyes drifted to the window again, watching the clouds roll by. He reminded himself that patience was not weakness. It was strength. And in this moment, his strength was silent, steady, and unshakable. The flight continued, and while the woman remained unsettled, the man sat quietly, ready for whatever would come next, knowing that how he carried himself was more important than any words she could say. The plane had been in the air for about 30 minutes when the cabin began to settle. Passengers leaned back, closed their eyes, or focused on screens. The steady hum of the engines and the slight vibration of the cabin created a rhythm that usually made people relax. But in the first-class section, tension still lingered. The woman across the aisle from the man had not stopped watching him. She kept adjusting her seat, crossing her arms, and shifting her weight. Every time he moved or glanced out the window, she seemed ready to erupt again. Her face was tight with frustration, and her hands fidgeted nervously in her lap. She whispered angrily to the man beside her. "I still don't get it," she muttered. "This is insane. How can they let him sit here?" The man by the window ignored her, as he had all along. He had learned long ago that reacting to unreasonable anger often made things worse. His calmness was deliberate, almost like a shield. He focused instead on the book he had pulled from his bag, letting the words fill his mind and drown out the tension around him. Nearby passengers noticed the discomfort but stayed silent. Some glanced at their phones, pretending to scroll, while others watched quietly, curious to see how the situation would unfold. A few had started recording the scene discreetly, sensing that what was happening was unusual and unfair. The woman finally pressed the call button again. The small chime echoed in the cabin, and a flight attendant appeared almost immediately. The woman wasted no time. "There's a problem again," she said, her voice slightly louder than before. "This man does not belong here. He shouldn't be in first class." The attendant listened patiently. Her tone was calm, but firm. "Sir is in the correct seat, ma'am. Everything has been checked." The woman's face flushed. She leaned toward the aisle. I don't care. It's uncomfortable. I paid for this seat. I don't want to sit next to him. The man by the window looked up briefly, meeting her gaze for a moment. There was no anger in his eyes, only quiet dignity. I am not taking anyone's seat. This is my assigned place. I am not bothering anyone. The flight attendant nodded politely. I understand, ma'am, but sir is correct. He has a boarding pass for this seat. There is nothing more to do. The woman turned away, muttering to herself. Her words were low but full of frustration. The people sitting near her exchanged glances. Some sighed, some frowned, some whispered to each other. The energy in the cabin was uneasy, a mixture of tension and curiosity. As the flight continued, the woman's agitation seemed to grow. She whispered repeatedly to the man beside her, questioning his presence, criticizing the airline, and muttering about fairness. Each time, the man by the window remained calm, reading quietly or looking out the window at the sky. A young couple seated a few rows behind noticed the tension. The woman whispered to her partner, "Why is she acting like that? He hasn't done anything." Her partner shrugged. "I don't know. Some people just react like that." The woman across the aisle leaned forward slightly, whispering more loudly this time. "I don't understand how anyone would let him sit here. I've never seen anything like this." The man did not respond. He did not need to. His silence spoke louder than any words. There was a quiet strength in the way he carried himself, a steady presence that seemed to fill the space around him. Passengers nearby began to notice the contrast. The woman's voice was sharp, tense, and judgmental. The man's presence was calm, composed, and firm. It created an invisible line in the cabin, dividing reaction from restraint, chaos from control. The woman's frustration grew. She leaned back in her seat and huffed, clearly expecting someone to validate her complaints. But no one did. Passengers pretended to read, to work on their laptops, or to look out the window. The flight attendants moved through the cabin, offering drinks and assistance, giving the woman polite smiles but no encouragement. After a few minutes, the woman pressed the call button once more. The attendant appeared, giving her the same calm, patient explanation. "Sir is in the correct seat. Sir has a boarding pass." There is nothing more to do. The woman's jaw tightened. She crossed her arms and muttered to herself, clearly irritated. Her eyes never left the man by the window, scanning him as if trying to find something that would justify her anger. But there was nothing. He was quiet, composed, and utterly undisturbed by her behavior. The man leaned back and closed his eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath. He reminded himself that calmness was not weakness. It was strength. He had faced judgment, prejudice, and misunderstandings many times in his life, and he knew that reacting angrily would only give power to behavior that did not deserve it. The woman's whispers continued, a low hum of irritation and disbelief. She leaned toward the aisle, glancing at nearby passengers, as if expecting someone to step in and remove him. But the cabin remained neutral. People focused on themselves, on their screens, on whatever distraction they could find. A few looked directly at the scene, shaking their heads quietly. The man turned his attention back to the book in his lap. He read for a while, letting the words absorb his focus. The woman's muttering was still audible, but it no longer had the power to disturb him. His calm, quiet presence seemed to settle some of the tension around him. A few passengers whispered to each other, curious about the man's identity. "Who is he?" One said quietly. "He's so calm. I don't think she's going to win this argument." The man beside the irritated woman tried to shrug it off. "I don't know," he said. "Maybe she's just having a bad day. Ignore her." The woman huffed again and leaned back in her seat, clearly not satisfied. She stared at the man as he continued to read. There was no reaction, no anger, no discomfort. Just calm. A flight attendant walked by once more, offering drinks. The woman shook her head at her, muttering that she didn't want anything. The man accepted a glass of water politely, nodding to the attendant. The cabin slowly began to return to its rhythm. People leaned back, adjusted their seats, and tried to settle in. But the energy around the two seats remained different. Passengers sensed that something unusual had happened, something that did not need words to be understood. The man glanced out the window briefly, watching the clouds drift past. He thought about how patience and quiet dignity often spoke louder than anger and complaint. He thought about the countless times people had judged him without reason, and how he had learned to let calmness carry him through. The woman, meanwhile, continued to fidget. She muttered quietly to herself, clearly not ready to give up. Every so often she glanced around, perhaps hoping someone would agree with her or intervene. But no one did. The cabin remained focused on routine, not on her complaints. The man returned to his book, reading a few pages. He leaned back in his seat, feeling the subtle vibration of the plane beneath him. He reminded himself that this moment, like all moments, would pass. His patience was a shield, and he would not let someone else's anger disturb his peace. Passengers around began to notice the contrast even more clearly. The woman's frustration was loud, restless, and exhausting to witness. The man's calmness was quiet, steady, and commanding respect without a single raised voice. Eventually, the woman slumped slightly in her seat, still watching him but less aggressively. The flight attendants moved past, checking passengers, offering assistance, and smiling politely at both. The man accepted the professionalism with a quiet nod, acknowledging the effort without allowing it to change the energy in the cabin. The flight continued. Clouds drifting past the windows, engines humming steadily, passengers gradually settling into their journey. And through it all, the tension between the woman and the man remained. A silent reminder that dignity and calmness could carry a weight far heavier than anger or prejudice. The man's presence seemed to calm some of the nearby passengers. A few smiled at him quietly, offering subtle gestures of respect. Others whispered softly to each other about the scene, noting the stark difference between his composed presence and her growing frustration. Even as the plane leveled out at cruising altitude, the woman continued to watch him, muttering under her breath, fuming silently. But the man remained calm, poised, and composed, a quiet center of strength in the otherwise ordinary flight. And in that moment, it was clear to everyone who was paying attention. Anger and judgment might demand attention, but patience and dignity had a power all their own. The plane had been cruising for nearly an hour when something subtle began to shift in the cabin. Passengers were starting to relax, pulling out headphones, opening laptops, and leaning back to enjoy the flight. But the tension in the first-class section, around the window seat where the man sat, had not fully dissipated. The woman across the aisle continued to glance at him, muttering under her breath, her frustration simmering just below the surface. The man by the window remained calm, reading quietly, occasionally glancing out at the clouds. He seemed completely unaffected by her irritation, completely unbothered. Every movement was deliberate, measured, composed. He sipped from his water bottle, adjusted the pages of his book, and settled back, giving off an aura of quiet confidence. A flight attendant appeared again, this time with a tray of snacks and drinks for first-class passengers. She smiled politely at everyone, including the woman. "Would you like something to eat or drink?" she asked. The woman waved her hand dismissively, muttering that she wasn't hungry. Her eyes, however, never left the man. The attendant turned to him next. He politely declined the food, shaking his head, and the attendant moved on. As she walked away, The man caught her eye for a brief moment and gave a small nod of acknowledgement. Calm and courteous Dot, it was then that one of the passengers nearby leaned toward their companion, whispering quietly, "Do you know who he is?" The others shook their head. "No, but he doesn't look like someone you'd question. Calm, collected. He carries himself differently." The whispering began to ripple through the nearby seats, quiet conversations about the man's presence. A few passengers pulled out their phones again, subtle camera angles capturing the scene. But the man didn't seem to notice. He was entirely in his own space, composed and patient. Meanwhile, the woman's muttering continued. "I still don't understand why they would allow this. I paid for this seat. This isn't right. How can anyone just let this happen?" Her voice carried enough that a few people nearby glanced at her. But their expressions were more of concern for her behavior than for the man she was harassing. Finally, something unexpected happened. One of the flight attendants returned, accompanied by the senior flight attendant, who was clearly there to handle a delicate situation. She approached the woman and spoke softly but firmly. "Ma'am, we've addressed the seating issue. Everything is in order. We ask that you remain seated and allow all passengers to enjoy the flight." The woman's jaw tightened as she opened her mouth, ready to argue, but the senior attendant held up a hand. "Please," she said, calm but authoritative. "Further complaints about this matter will be handled after landing. Right now, everything is fine. Everyone has the correct seat." The woman huffed and crossed her arms, muttering again under her breath. She leaned back, clearly still irritated, but realizing that the fight had reached a limit. She kept glancing at the man, still curious, still unconvinced. Then something remarkable happened. A passenger sitting 2 rows behind the man, a young woman working on a laptop, whispered to her companion, "I think I know who he is." Her companion leaned closer. "Who?" The young woman smiled quietly. "I've seen him on the news before. He's not just anyone. He's someone important." The man by the window, unaware of the whispers around him, kept reading, his presence calm, his posture strong. But the energy in the cabin began to shift. The whispers spread, softly at first, then gaining momentum. People started to lean in slightly, curious, watching him more closely. A man in the aisle seat 2 rows back finally whispered, loud enough for a few nearby passengers to hear, "That's him. He's the one. He's incredible." A ripple of recognition spread quietly through the cabin. Passengers who had been quietly observing began to connect the dots. The man who had endured the woman's relentless scrutiny without raising his voice or showing anger was someone whose reputation preceded him. The woman across the aisle noticed the change in energy. Heads were turning subtly in his direction. Whispers began circulating. People were exchanging glances and quiet comments, nodding to one another. She leaned forward slightly, frowning. "What are they whispering about?" She muttered about one of the passengers nearby, sensing her curiosity, whispered softly, not wanting to be rude, "He's very well known, very respected. You should probably calm down." The woman's face paled slightly. She looked at him again, this time not with irritation, but with something closer to shock. She leaned back, fidgeting nervously. Her muttering slowed, replaced by a tense silence. The man, still calm, closed his book and looked around the cabin briefly. He had sensed the subtle shift in the energy. People were watching him differently now, not with judgment, but with recognition. He smiled faintly, a small, polite smile, not triumphant, not gloating, just courteous. Passengers began nodding subtly toward him, small gestures of respect. A few offered quiet smiles, acknowledging the calm strength he had shown throughout the encounter. Even those who had been indifferent before now seemed to appreciate the way he had handled the situation with grace. The woman across the aisle, realizing the whispers were about him, shifted uncomfortably. Her irritation gave way to embarrassment. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but no words came. She looked down at her hands, twisting them nervously in her lap. The flight attendants moved through the cabin again, offering drinks and assistance. Some of the passengers now seemed more relaxed, inspired by the quiet dignity the man had maintained. He accepted a glass of water politely, nodding at the attendant, and returned to observing the clouds outside the window. Whispers continued quietly, but they were now respectful, admiring. People were talking about his accomplishments, his calm demeanor, and how he had handled the woman's harassment without raising his voice or reacting with anger. The woman, isolated in her own embarrassment, fidgeted nervously. She had expected him to react, to argue, to prove her wrong. But he had done none of that. He had simply existed with quiet strength, letting his dignity speak louder than any words ever could. The man finally set his book aside and straightened in his seat. His hands rested calmly in his lap. He looked out the window again, a faint smile on his face, appreciating the clouds rolling past. He had endured the situation without losing composure, and the recognition of his identity in the cabin had only strengthened his quiet confidence. A few passengers who had been observing everything carefully whispered to each other, marveling at the contrast between the woman's agitation and his calmness. They spoke about how patience and dignity could carry more weight than anger or aggression. The woman across the aisle looked at him one last time, her face a mixture of shock and realization. She leaned back in her seat, silent now. Her muttering had stopped. Her eyes, wide and tense, reflected a new understanding that her assumptions had been completely wrong. The man remained quiet, composed, and polite. He did not gloat. He did not mock. He simply existed as he had from the beginning, calm, confident, and unshaken. Passengers continued to glance at him respectfully. Some whispered softly, others simply nodded, acknowledging the strength it took to remain calm under scrutiny. His quiet dignity had shifted the energy of the cabin entirely. The plane continued its journey, engines humming steadily, clouds drifting past. The incident, which had begun as a confrontation, had transformed into a lesson in patience, resilience, and quiet strength. Passengers were reminded that judgment often collapses when met with calm confidence and dignity. The woman across the aisle, now silent, sat tensely in her seat. She avoided looking directly at him, as if realizing that confrontation was no longer an option. Her assumptions had been proven wrong, and the recognition of his identity left her unsure how to proceed. The man, still composed, leaned back, letting the moment pass naturally. He understood that silence, calmness, and patience often spoke louder than words or anger. The cabin had shifted, subtly but unmistakably, acknowledging his presence and the quiet power he carried. And in that moment, it became clear to everyone. Sometimes strength is not loud or aggressive. Sometimes it is calm, patient, and unwavering. And sometimes it is enough to change the way the world around you perceives you.